Okay, we better get started. Father Keller's been running around and getting in trouble. I hope this works. So I switched memory cards because there's this faint little bird in my head that's telling me there's not a lot of room left on the other one. And I bought a new one. It's unbelievable. So there's a card, like the actual little memory chip is the size of your pinky fingernail. And it can hold like hundreds of hours of video. Like the world that we live in is pretty incredible. If you wanted to try the tea, one of them is a pu'er, which is a fermented tea. They're known for being really good for digestion. The Chinese drink them for weight loss because somehow they're supposed to help you feel full. But I just like it. It's a different kind of tea. And then the other one is this Strawberry Fields, it's called. They're both from a place in Burnsville, Minnesota called Indigo Tea Company. They're an excellent place. And strawberry is really hard to do well. It's not a flavor that shows up in a lot of teas because strawberries don't produce an oily substance like some of the other fruits do. So it's hard to get things that are actually strawberry flavored. About the only thing you can do is use strawberry pieces or puree them. But if you think of like an orange, if you press on the rind, gets that kind of waxy, really smelly stuff. That's an essential oil, basically. And what it means is that's part of what gives it its flavor. And the fruits that do that are easy to flavor other things with. So you can do that with orange, peppermint does it, there's lots of them that do it. But strawberry doesn't. Strawberries don't have that same kind of thing. So they're a bit grouchier to use in things. So this is one strawberry thing that's done well, if you like that. I have a friend, strawberry is her favorite flavor, and I got her into drinking tea. Surprise, surprise. And we haven't found too many strawberry ones that are done really well, because they just don't come out. In case you need it, I did send out to the whole group a link to the Come and See Bible study. So if you were wondering if you're getting the emails or if you're on the group, you can check and see if you got one this morning, because you should have it by the time you get home. Like I said, I'm not super confident that the text is going to be quite as helpful. I've used some of the Come and See things before, but it's well done. It's still Catholic. The guy that is one of the main authors is from Montana. So he's a rural, small town parish priest, and he has a degree from a school called the Biblicum in Rome. It basically means the Bible school, the Biblicum, it's what it's called. I don't know. The Pontifical Biblical Institute of yada, yada, yada. It's got some long name. But he's got this degree. That degree is one of the toughest degrees in the world to get. There's only a few hundred people that have them. Like, you have to be fluent in 5 or 6 ancient languages to apply. Not you have to know them, but you have to be able to speak them just offhand. And it's stuff that you haven't heard of before. Some of them you probably have, like Latin and Greek are two of the standards. Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. But then it's stuff like Aramaic and Ugaritic and some of these other things that sort of leave you scratching your head. And then he went back, so he got this degree. It's like being a rocket scientist. And then went back to being a small town parish priest. But, we are beneficiaries of some of his work, because like I said, I've used some of it, his commentary, and this Bible study series. So the Come and See series does go through the entire, it might even be the entire Bible now. It's most of them. And like I said, it'll be a different flavor. You're in for easier questions. You'll be really excited, which probably means I'll have to ask some of my own and add to it. So I think last time we kind of ended in a hurry, so we'll review things and we'll stop in a happier place today. By the way, next week, next Tuesday, is October 31st, which means it's the day before All Saints' Day. I knew that was on the tip of your tongue. So All Saints' Day is November 1st, next Wednesday, and that is a holy day of obligation. And one of the great days. It's one of my favorite days of the entire year to celebrate because it's sort of specifically for the people in heaven who haven't been canonized. You know, for the saints in heaven that don't have another feast day on the calendar, All Saints' Day is for them. And that can be really comforting to think about if you have relatives or family members who died in a good place with the Lord or who were reconciled to Him at the end of their lives or however it worked. This is their feast day. So it is kind of neat that way. And then the day after All Saints' Day is All Souls' Day. It's a day where we often traditionally visit graves and bless them and pray for the souls of those who have died. So those are coming next week. So last time we talked about Paul getting on a boat. It wasn't going to go well. They get caught in this storm out in the Mediterranean, and they get blown. We don't know exactly how far. You know, when you're on an ocean that's angry and waves are tall and they're smashing into your boat, and you don't have GPS in the ancient world, figuring out where you are is done by looking at the stars. And if you can't see the stars, knowing where you are is challenging because they have these strange effects. The sea, once you're on it, in the middle of it, and you can't see land in any direction, all looks the same. And so it's one of the places where it can be very disorienting. Like, as humans, we're not good at not having points of reference. They found some of that, like if you get released in the middle of a desert, or some of you know that if you've been somewhere and the landscape is all the same, and you drive for a while and the landscape is still the same, it is very challenging in your head to keep your sense of place and where you're at in the world. GPS is extremely helpful for that. Be kind of funny to learn, if they had GPS and they're like, we were inches from crashing, not like long ways away, but they didn't. So they sail from Crete, which is an island south of Greece. They sail to the west toward Italy. And on the way, they encounter this storm, and it says it blows them toward Sirte. Sirte, or the Sirte Rise, Sirtis, whatever it is, who knows how you say all these words, but they are off the north coast of Africa. So I would argue that at least the story seems to indicate that they're blown hundreds of miles off course, which makes sense. They're on the sea. We talked last time about a lot of the fear and frustration. I think that is very real. We talked about feeling unanchored or unmoored in the storm, and how that happens in our lives too. How we struggle to find safe harbor. And I think this is one of the places where I just have to appreciate, and I think you do as well, we don't have a seafaring culture, so we don't quite have the same sense of storms and problems on the ocean that other people did. But one of the things, if you visit Portugal, in Catholic countries, and even before they were Catholic, even in the ancient pagan world, they almost always had a temple to some god or another that was the protector from the sea, that was the god of the ocean. And in Christianity, that often takes the form, you'll find like a chapel dedicated to Our Lady quite often, or there could be particular saints, but it's often like the Our Lady of the Seas, Our Lady of the Safe Harbor, or something like that. But you'll often find it planted like right on the beach. And they tended to be places where the families of mariners would go and pray for safe return. Because, you know, in the ancient world, I don't know how many voyages failed or were lost, but it was probably like everyone in town knew someone that went to sea one day and they never saw them again. And, you know, that was just a part of their culture. So there's a sense of the loss. Now it's not nearly so dangerous. I mean, the sea can still be kind of crazy, but it's not like it was. The big ocean-going boats don't capsize very often. After some of the disasters, they have made them have bigger lifeboats and more lifeboats. But if you think about our own day, like, I don't think I've ever heard of a cruise ship that went down and everyone died on it. Like the massive newer ships. If you think about how many people live on them, you know, when they're out on the ocean, it's gotten a lot safer. But it's not as safe at this time. And it feels kind of funny. I wonder, like, what Paul was like. I told you so. I told you this wasn't going to go well. You thought that this was a good idea. Whose idea was this again? You know, and for the Romans, I mean, this is one of the places too where you have to think of the different groups. The Roman soldier is like, we're going to believe the sailors. The sailors say it's going to be fine. So they sail, and what happens? It's not fine. So the Roman probably blamed the sailors. If you're in a situation like that and people are scared for their lives, it's a situation of tension. And the Romans have swords. So they're out on the sea for a long time. They're afraid that they're going to run aground on this rocky coast. They have been tossed about, and the sailors they decide to abandon the ship. They're just going to make a break for it and jump off, which means they're pretty desperate or pretty caught in despair. And Paul tells them at that point, no. This is on page 179. They make a plan to leave. They're going to lay out these anchors, and then they're just going to leave the ship. They're lowering the small ship into the water. Somehow Paul realizes what they're doing, and he says, if you leave, you're going to die. God has only promised that he is going to save the people who stay on this boat. So if you leave, you're taking your life into your own hands. They're leaving the soldiers and prisoners on board. This is a pretty big deal, because you would think that the sailors are the ones who know how to sail the ship. They're also the ones who have a vested financial interest in the ship surviving the journey. And they decide to leave. They decide to flee. Paul warns the centurion, and this is part of this chapter, is the journey of the centurion to trust in Paul. And I think by extension, trust in the Lord. Because if you remember at first, he was the one who was trying to find a boat to sail on, and it wasn't working. And so he's working hard, and then he eventually finds this, I think it's an Alexandrian grain ship that's heading toward Italy. And Paul is like, I think we should wait, I think we should slow down, let's put in for the winter. The soldier and the sailor say, no, we're going to keep going. And the soldier trusts the sailors. Now, at this point in the story, things have shifted. And the soldier decides to trust Paul. They cut the lifeboat adrift. Now that's a fascinating thing as well, because it's like they're removing the means of escape. When you got no more lifeboat, you're tied to the life of the ship. But I think this can be important too. Like, there's all kinds of times where trying to save a way out isn't good. It isn't helpful. If you think of people that end up addicted to something, even if they don't end up addicted to it, it's like, well, I have to save a little bit just in case. You know, that same instinct can be with us. And at this point, I think it's a sign of trust. The soldier is like, we're not going to save the lifeboat to get out later. We're going to cast our lot with you, Paul, and with this God that you believe in. They're not giving themselves an easy out. And then Paul says, you should eat something. Now, this is probably one of the most uncanny parts of this, is like the house, if you lived in Florida and you're in the middle of a hurricane, and the hurricane's been roaring and raging for days, and it's rained, and you don't have power, and all of that, and Paul shows up, he's like, now we should throw a party. Now you should eat. And it's like, we haven't had enough food for days. How are we going to survive? And for Paul, it's because he knows deliverance is coming. He knows that the winds are going to change, that something is moving away. The time for danger is already long past. This is another interesting part, because sometimes something outside of us, the storm outside of us, eventually comes inside and rocks the interior boat. This is very true of COVID. We lived through this in our society, and I think you felt it. So there was the concern at first that this was a serious illness and we have to make all these changes to try and be helpful. And then, after a while, they're like, okay, we actually don't. Like, lots of these things aren't really helping. There's not a lot of scientific validation to it. But that doesn't mean that the problem which was outside and went inside is now taken care of. And so hopefully this isn't something that you've encountered too often. But for instance, there's still people who are paralyzed at going out of their house. They won't go out without wearing masks. I've heard of stories where people are still very much caught in the anxiety about COVID, and they don't want to die and they don't want to suffer with it. And it's like the medical danger is long past. At this point, COVID medically looks a lot more like a seasonal flu. It doesn't, in fact, it's actually now less deadly than seasonal flus, go figure. Statistically, it's become that. But just because that's what the statistics say and what the actual evidence on the ground says, it doesn't mean that it solved the entire problem. And so there you see a time where you had a situation, it causes anxiety. When the situation changes, the anxiety can still be present. This is the case for a lot of people with heart attacks, for instance. If you're in a relationship and your spouse has a heart attack, one of the most difficult things that they're finally starting to recognize is the fear that that creates. So on the part of wives, for a husband who has a heart attack, very often they get almost paralyzed, that he can't do any physical work at all. And so the wife will be on his case like an angry cat if he tries to do anything. And that actually ends up being worse for the person. Like, there is a sense where you have to reconcile yourself to, I need to learn to live again and not just be afraid of everything all the time. I have a friend from Grand Forks who is in her early 60s and had a massive heart attack that should have just about killed her. But her husband was really fast thinking and they got to the hospital with a few minutes to spare. And, you know, part of it that I talked to them a little bit about is wrestling with the anxiety that that creates. And, you know, even her doctor has said, well, we've looked at things. You don't have other areas of issue. They put in a stent or whatever to hold the one spot open. And you need to go back to living your life. Because if you stay paralyzed in anxiety forever, that's not good. I think that's kind of the landscape that Paul is wrestling with here. And again, I think those are ways of hearing it or of receiving it in our lives that are really important. That just because a storm is finished on the outside doesn't mean it's done on the inside. And there's more processing, there's more emotion sometimes to work through or to sit with than what meets the eye. I think it's also kind of like, if you were caught in a storm for days or weeks, if I was caught in a storm for this, if you were caught in a storm for this, being a North Dakotan, what do you think your likely state is by this point? Nauseous, yeah. Seasick, be like, get me off this darn body of water, right? Like, God, why did you even create all this dumb stuff? What a bad idea. If you've been seasick, people don't like getting seasick, and if you've been seasick for days, caught in a giant storm, afraid for your life, it would be like, get me away from here now. And Paul says you should eat. It's like, eating is just about the furthest thing from your mind in that point, right? Even if you get a stomach flu, this is one of the things that can be kind of challenging, is that usually it's good to start eating something. If it's been a day or more and you still can feel nauseous, but sometimes starting to nibble on some crackers or some other things actually ends up settling your stomach and helping you. And you have to start eating something. But I think that this is one of those places where it's like the soldiers decide that they're going to trust Paul, and then Paul tells them to eat, and they're like, you're from Mars. But I think Paul also probably wasn't railing against them the whole time. Paul is probably not adding fuel to the fire anymore. At least I hope. I wonder if that's one of the lessons for him. Like, there is a time for strength, and there is a time to really press people and to try and convict them of the need for conversion. And there's a time for gentleness, a time when faith needs to be like Psalm 23, the Lord leading you beside still waters. And I think Paul discovers, at least on this journey, that now is a time for gentleness. And then he does something that's even more bizarre. It says he breaks bread with them. So he celebrates the Mass. And there's something profoundly beautiful about that. Like, the storm is over. Now he's working with this problem in their hearts, and he celebrates the Mass. And it's hard to imagine because there's a lot of arguably pagan people on board. So who does he celebrate Mass with? But he gives thanks to God in the midst of their difficulties. He stops to praise the Lord. He eats in front of them. I have to imagine him a little bit like, well, if you don't want to eat, that's fine, but I'm having some food. Sometimes you do just have to take care of biology. You just have to take care of the human basics. Mother Teresa talked about this, like that you can preach about salvation all you want, but if somebody's hungry, you feed them first. And there is a time for that, a time of gentleness. It notes that there's 276 people on the boat. That seems like a lot to me. I suspect that it's somewhat crowded. Being close to a mass of humanity for weeks in the middle of a storm on the ocean does not, it's just not on my bucket list. It might be on your bucket list. If it is, I can help you find the Pauline tour company that, sends you off on shipwrecks. But otherwise, it just doesn't seem so good. So they throw the wheat into the sea. They decide that the boat needs to be lighter. They start dumping their cargo. I mean, in a way, it's like they're abandoning hope. They're abandoning the reason for their voyage. But now it's also to allow them to go closer to the shore. So part of it is that although the water can feel deep, when it comes to big boats, you need a lot of water to float them. And they were on a grain ship. Those were heavy. They sat low in the water. So now they try to lighten the ship by throwing the grain overboard. They're getting close. They did not recognize the place. They find a bay with a beach, and they want to make for it. But it's like something is still going to go wrong. You know, that warning of Paul that the boat isn't going to be saved, I think, at least as readers of the story, echoes in our mind. It looks like they're through the storm. They're like close to shore. They can see it. They're getting all excited. Everything's fine. We're going to be fine. There's dry land. They cast off their anchors. This is it. Like, they are committed to this. They unfastened the rudder lines. If you remember earlier, they had put some ropes or some cables around the boat to help stabilize it in the waves because they thought it was breaking apart or going to break apart. They hoist the foresail. So this is where also, because we don't have a seafaring culture, someday when you want an experience, watch a video about how complicated sailing is on a big ship, and the number of ropes and lines and things that you have to tie and pulleys and yada, yada, yada. It's not an easy thing. So this is a good spot where I was like, well, what's a foresail? Well, I don't know. It sounds like it's at the front of the boat, but what does that mean? And in this case, it was a smaller sail that could be used. If you flip back to the picture of the ship on page 175, you see the foresail way out front on the post that sticks out. So it's a little sail that's used kind of like a modern trawling motor when you want to go slowly. That's the sail that they're talking about, that front one. So they're moving slowly toward the beach, and then they run aground on a sandbar. Their plans are frustrated again. And now the real problem comes out. So the bow of the boat is immobilized. They hit this sandbar, and if you hit a sandbar on a boat like this hard, like, they probably smashed a good number of things and got some injuries. It's one of those places where, like, being on a moving object and hitting something that's not moving and going from moving to not moving is a rather dramatic change. You know, so they probably crashed and fell down and smashed into the ground, unless they maybe knew they were close and they were able to brace themselves or not be around other stuff. But what happens is the stern of the boat is still being smashed by the waves, and the bow can't move. And so the waves are now starting to rip the boat apart before their eyes. At this point, the guards decide that they should kill all the prisoners. Probably, now it sounds like a strange thing for us, but we encountered that time earlier when Paul was arrested and he escaped from prison, or he could have escaped from prison, but he didn't, he stayed there. And the soldier that guarded it is going to kill himself, and Paul says, no, stop, we're all still here. And then the man ends up desiring to be a Christian. But here, what you see is that the people charged with the care of prisoners, if the prisoners escape, they just killed them all. So it's much easier to justify to a Roman magistrate why you don't have any prisoners and they're all dead than not to have prisoners, because then they'll just kill you. And again, I think at this point it's really odd Because if you're in a situation like this that's life and death, there were no more prisoners and soldiers. There were no more rich and poor. You were all people. You're all subject to something bigger than yourselves. And at that point, it doesn't matter if you're a slave or you're free. It doesn't matter if you're wealthy or not, right? You have survived this chaotic mess of a storm. You end up close to Malta. And for a long time in this story, you've all been equal. You've all been on the same footing. And now it's like as the storm is fading, the social hierarchy reemerges. But the centurion decides he wants to save Paul. So it's come full circle now. The centurion says, no, you can't kill this guy. And so they decide not to kill anyone. His heart seems to be changing. So they send off swimmers. Some of them get to shore. Some of them cling to pieces of wood as the boat breaks apart. But eventually they all reach shore safely. Eventually they're off of the water, on the land, and they probably even ate a mouthful of sand because they were so darn excited. I mean, by that point, I think kissing the ground would be the least dramatic of the gestures that I would be inclined to do. I think I'd get away from the water and just lay on the beach for a while or something. But I think that this points to a truth of Christianity and a truth of who we are. That when we say Christianity is a shelter in the storm, that Jesus is a sure anchor or the harbor, this is kind of what it means. Jesus at the end of his Sermon on the Mount talks about those who follow these words of mine are those who build their house on solid rock. The winds come and the waves buffet the house. They smash into it, but the structure survives. The one that rejects my words is like the man who builds his house on sand. The wind comes and the waves smash into you and all is lost. And I think it's important to realize in that life has its storms. Jesus doesn't say, follow me and everything will be peachy. Jesus doesn't say, build your house on the rock and there will never be a problem. But he says, if you build your house on the rock, when there are problems, you will have a sure foundation. And I think that has a lot to speak to us. There are times in life where problems come about. As you age, they tend to be of the physical nature. You have to deal with letting go and surrender and these challenges. Sometimes the storm is not in your own life, it's in the life of your children or your friends or people around you. But I think there is a powerful lesson in the midst of this journey